Meet Reed Lance Rosenthal, rancher, #1 best-selling award-winning author, and unabashedly, unapologetically on the right side of the outstanding issues of our generation. But don't try to fence him in. Sometimes his positions will surprise you, because Reed is definitely his own man, with his own opinions. You might love him, you might hate him, but you won't be able to stop listening. Step over to the right side with Reed.
Howdy, listeners and viewers from coast to coast, the Gulf to the 51st state, and around the globe. Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side Radio and the Cowboy's Take. First of all, let me tell you that despite my best intentions to get this show out 3 or 4 days ago, we had technical problems. So we have upgraded our Zoom so we can now do split screen and interviews, which we're going to start doing. A lot of people have asked for that. I have some great names I'll be interviewing, both in the financial field, the economic field, and also in the geopolitical field, and in some cases, experts in all those fields. So you can be looking forward to that. Secondly, it's been a busy, busy week, augmented by, yes, it was the week I got a new phone, because finally my old phone was on its deathbed, and switched providers, which is great because, I'm not a fan of Verizon. They're a little too woke for me, and they're a little too expensive for me. And on top of that, I don't know, there's probably a number of you out there listening, but so Microsoft in its infinite wisdom, probably in cahoots with the hardware manufacturers around the country and around the globe, has decided it's no longer supporting Windows 10 as of October 10th or 11th or 12th or whatever it is. So if you have a device that is operating on Windows 10, which I finally got used to after a decade, you now have to get rid of that device so that you can go to Windows 11, which, by the way, I can't stand. So overarching all that is the fact that I'm a dinosaur. I am not a technical whiz. I am not a computer guru. I really kind of hate all that stuff. I mean, on, off, detach, attach, and send. Those are my commands. In any event, it's been a week of trials and tribulations on the technical front, but I think, since you're now seeing the show, that we are over the hump. This show is going to be, as I promised you a week ago, sorry about that, on the European Union. Because what happens to the European Union is, number one, kind of a big canary, maybe a crow, in the coal mine as to what we might expect here in the United States. Number two, because the collapse of the European Union, which I think is imminent, will have huge effects around the globe, economically, militarily, the balance of power, the multipolar world of superpowers, China, Russia, and the United States. It's a really big deal. And in the next show, which now that we have, I think, the technical problem solved, will be in the next few days, I'm going to tell you about why the EU is splintering, what's happening to them economically, how the bad decisions of their globalist, elitist, incompetent people who are running the European Union have contributed to this, along with, I don't know, I'm not in those countries. I'm not a citizen of Germany or France or Britain. But the traitorous behavior of the globalists in charge of those countries, acting in concert with the globalists who are running the EU, has created a disaster over there in a whole bunch of ways, all of which affect you and I and this country and the planet. So that will be coming up next. But for me to get into that, and I'll probably have an interview with an expert the week after, or actually several days later, on that whole subject. You can hear it from somebody far more versed than your hayseed here. You need to know what the EU is and how it came to be, because that history is the foundation of its current spiral downward potential demise. I'm going to bring you some rat-a-tat-tat, and then we're going to get into the meat of the show, so to speak. But I'm going to start off with a ranch story. So we're getting ready for winter out here on the ranch. Been a busy week. And there is a million things you have to do out here in the middle of nowhere to prepare for a Wyoming winter, be it mild or be it severe. And this is the land of extremes, as are most remote places, no matter where located on the planet. So all the contingencies, never mind the long-range weather forecasting that you look at, Farmer's Almanac and Open Snow, and I mean, we have about 5 or 6 that we follow rather religiously, and rarely, by the way, are they in agreement. So in the end, it'll be what it'll be. But you have markers to put out on the road. These are 6-foot pieces of pipe that we've cut, old kind of white plumbing pipe, and put markers, reflective markers on the top, and we bury posts into the ground and then sink those over the posts, and that marks the road all the way out to the main road, because there are times, folks, when literally at night, if you have to plow to stay ahead of a storm, or even during the day, if it's really an intensive storm, you literally don't know if you're on the road or not. It is a whiteout. And those markers help immensely. And then we have hay to move and hay to stack for winter. Right now it's in stacks that make it easy to load on buyers' trucks and trailers. But pretty soon now, the buyers' trucks and trailers will cease coming, at least for a while, and you have to have the hay in a certain pattern to best withstand, not totally, but best withstand winter weather, rain and snow, etc. And one of these days we're going to have a hay barn, because with the amount of hay we're now producing and the increases forecast for the next few years, that is just good business. In fact, we should have put it up 2 years ago. And then for winter, you have to shut down the ponds, get them, the reservoirs, and get them in balance. Start dumping water back to the creek so you don't have a frozen overflow on any pond that could damage a dam. You have to shut down the pivot, winterize it, or bad things will happen. Nothing like a busted pump that freezes and cracks. It can get expensive. And I can go on and on and on down the list. I mean, that's just kind of the broad brush, just to give you a feel for all the things that go on, along with getting equipment ready for the winter, winterizing it, getting antifreeze into it, doing the oil changes after the summer's use, etc. Anyway, the moral of this ranch story is PPPPP. You've heard me say it before. Prior planning prevents poor performance. And out here, where help is not coming, prior planning can mean the difference between waking up in the morning or maybe not. But I kind of like that. I kind of like living in a place that can, shall we say, do lethal damage to you if you don't keep your wits about you. So now, let me give you the founder's quote. And this is not a founder, it's Thomas Paine, great patriot. His booklet, Common Sense, sold tens of thousands of copies, which in the Revolutionary War period, leading up to the Revolutionary War, is the same with a population of 4 million people in all of America, as the most wild New York Times bestseller would be in today's 350 million population environment in the United States. And he, probably more than anyone else, got people thinking and fomented the spirit of the revolution, which became the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the United States of America. This is his quote. And based on the stories I'm going to be bringing you here over the next several weeks, people who have forgotten what it means to be free, who have unfortunately docilely given up their liberties, their freedoms, and their means to protect those. This is particularly apropos. Thomas Paine, quote, "Those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must, like men, undergo the fatigues of supporting it." Unquote. How true. True now, true then, and true forevermore. Let's do a little rat-a-tat-tat. Number one, I got a lot of comments on my dots that I threw out there on the assassin of Charlie Kirk. And unfortunately, there's a bunch of people who like to do clickbait, not only in the news, the mainstream media, as worthless as they are, but also on YouTube and all the video channels. And I mean, there's just been some wild speculations. I mean, I heard the other day that the Israelis did it, and there was a trap door behind poor Charlie Kirk, and he was shot from behind. Anybody who's seen the video knows that. I mean, it's not even worth discussing. But these tend to take away from the real import of his assassination, and that is who done it, who was behind it, and why. And I continue to think that there is much more to this story that we don't know. I do believe that the transsexual involved shooter was susceptible because of the use of drugs, either by he or his roommate or both. And those drugs created an unstable, obviously, mind. And an unstable mind is susceptible to mind control. And the people who control mind control, folks, are the government and the deep state. Perhaps the governments, who knows where, and the deep state. I'm going to revisit this in the future. For right now, I'll leave you with a happy part of the Charlie Kirk story, if there is one. And that is the state of Oklahoma is the first state, and God bless them. God bless the folks in the Department of Education of Oklahoma. They have made mandatory, as of last week, turning point classes throughout the high schools in Oklahoma. That is phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. There's a great article that and we have a bunch of videos and a bunch of articles posted, as we always do, on OnTheRightSideRadio.com. You know, if you go to that website and you read the articles and you spend half an hour a week, you will know more, unfortunately, than 99.9% of your countrymen about what's going on internationally, domestically, geopolitically, and economically. It's just the way it is. I don't tell you anything that I can't back up or that I don't have a source for. And in most cases, since I was trained in journalism, two sources, a double source, which is a journalistic standard. There's a great article on the site this week from the Epoch Times on transsexual violence. You should read it. Ties in just a tad with my theory. And that's what it is. It's just a theory. And it also ties in with what's happening with targeted attacks on ICE. For instance, in Dallas and in Plainsville, Texas, and the targeted attacks on religious institutions, which seem to be ramping up right now. You know, there are a lot of susceptible minds out there. There are very few Americans, actually, I would love to know the percentages, who are not on some type of personality altering or mind altering drug, whether it's for anxiety or obesity or whatever it happens to be. And these people are all susceptible. There's a foreign element controlling parts of their metabolism and their brain. Anyway, something for you to think about. And remember, check out my two-part series on the history of mind control on the website. Just type it in the archives. It'll come right up. I think you'll find it fascinating. Okay. The Supreme Court has been busy. And most of the rulings have been great over the last week. They ended protected status for Venezuelan illegal aliens. Good. They ruled that Trump can hold back $4 billion in foreign aid from the recipients, who to a large degree are NGOs who just funnel it back into left-wing causes. I mean, that was the whole game that Biden Biden, Obama's third term and previous terms, played with your tax money, financing their political ends. Comey got indicted. Now, you know this from several weeks ago. What I'm really interested in is the general grand jury that's been convened in Florida. And I'm really interested in who else is going to get indicted. And then what those traitorous rats are going to do to throw each other under the bus to try and save their own lousy, nasty, irredeemable skins. This is going to be interesting here over the next month or so. One of the things I want you to keep in mind, I'm going to digress just a moment from rat-a-tat-tat. Even though Comey and the rest, whoever they may be, deserve it. They broke the law. In my mind, they should have been charged with treason, not just this, that, and the other. But so ye sow, or so you sow, so shall you reap. And in 2028, hopefully not, or 2032, or sometime in the future, you're going to have a president who does not think like Trump, who hates America like Obama did, and who does not love it like Trump does, for all his faults and all his mistakes, and he has plenty of each. And the precedents that are being set right now, be careful what you wish for coming in the future. I'm going to bring you some information on Canada next week and what they're doing in trying to literally confiscate all the firearms in Canada. It is a dastardly plan. And if you don't think it can happen here, you get the wrong people in power, folks. You get a few seats turning over in the Supreme Court. Not only can it happen here, they'll make sure it happens here. Probably met by a population not quite as docile as Canada's, I might add. A federal judge, yes, judges run wild down there, particularly when you're appointed by Obama, has halted the deportation of Guatemalans under a certain age. Okay, terrific. I'm sure that will be overturned. November 5th, the Supreme Court rules on whether or not Trump's tariffs are legal, whether he can do them, all or in part. As I've told you in previous shows, this is a really big deal. If they rule he can't do the tariffs, there's going to be repercussions in the market and the economy which you can't even begin to fathom. And, you know, whatever they rule, it's going to be a really big deal on November 5th or when the ruling comes out. Keep your ears to the track on that one. It will affect you, no matter what the ruling is. The Supreme Court is also slated to hear and decide on birthright citizenship, which, if you read the Constitution, is pretty clear. If you're born here, you're a citizen. However, that was back in the days where you didn't have illegal immigration or folks flying in to deliver a baby and flying back out 2 days later only to return with the U.S. citizen and 100 family members. So the times, they have changed. It'll be interesting to see what the Supreme Court does with this. And the Supreme Court has ruled that Trump can cancel billions of dollars in grants, which were once again going to the left-wing NGOs, the friends and buddies and financiers of Obama and his cabal, the left wing finance machine using your tax dollars, which is a terrific ruling, a terrific ruling. The Supreme Court is about to rule on whether an appeals court has ruled he cannot, whether Trump can fire Lisa Cook, one of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. As far as I'm concerned, he should fire all of them. Federal Reserve needs to go away. The problems with this country, whether it's inflation, depression, the ups and downs, the wild swings in economic cycles, started in 1913, which is when the Federal Reserve started. Up to then, yeah, you had your booms and your busts, but they pretty much sorted themselves out, and you had no inflation, zero, and you had wild growth, wild growth. growth. So Lisa Cook, if you pull up a picture of the Supreme Court and you find Lisa Cook in that picture, you know, usually those pictures are labeled as to who is who in the photo. It kind of tells you all you need to know. I'll just leave it at that, okay? We shall see how the Supreme Court rules. A lot of people think that they're going to rule against Trump on this using a court case which is known as Humphrey's Executor versus the United States, all the way back to 1935. Hamas. Supposedly, Israel has agreed, and supposedly all the other Arab countries are behind, and supposedly Hamas has also agreed to Trump's 20-point peace plan. Listen, more power to Trump for giving it a go. But you know, Hamas, radical Islamists, and Israelis are kind of like the frog and the scorpion. I've told you that story. A leopard does not change its spots, particularly with generational inbred hatreds fueled by religious fervor. And you could kind of say that on both sides. So, assuming that all this magical stuff actually plays out, that Hamas does return whatever poor hostages are still alive, and who knows how many that is, and whether Hamas is even telling the truth on that, I wouldn't bank too much on it. In fact, many, and there are videos on the website, on therightsideradio.com this week, with a lot of experts saying that Israel and the United States are marshaling forces to attack Iran again. And Iran is marshaling forces in concert with China and Russia. Gee, what could go wrong here? To defend against that attack and then counterattack. The Mideast is far from solved, folks. Just like Ukraine is far from solved. And just like a whole bunch of other things on the planet are far from solved. In fact, I think they are continuing to devolve. We will talk more about that in future shows, along with guests who know these sordid details of geopolitics, global geopolitics, far better than I. Okay, the Houthis, right? Supposedly we bombed the hell out of Yemen and the Houthis were done. And Iran wasn't supporting them anymore and blah, 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 blah. Well, in the last 3 or 4 days, in fact, had this show gotten out on time, the day before the show was scheduled to come out on Thursday, they attacked a British and disabled a British freighter. And the next day they attacked a tanker, disabled it, American flag tanker. And they have said unequivocally they're going to attack any and all shipping that has anything to do with the American flag or an American company, including the 13 major U.S. oil companies. Okay. The Mideast is far from solved, folks. Far from solved. Okay, and then there was a terror attack in Manchester, England, because England is upside down. It is far closer to civil war in England and France, I might add, than we are here. And, you know, we're not too far away from it here. So that'll give you an idea of the situation in England and France, which we'll be talking about in the next show, which has to do with the disintegration of the European Union and the reasons therefore. Venezuela. We're building up a huge armada of warships along with ground troops on amphibious landing crafts, etc., off the coast of Venezuela. Obviously, this is a play for Venezuelan oil. Just as obviously, Venezuela is supported by, kind of like Iran, Russia to a lesser extent, but very much by China, because China gets a lot of oil from Venezuela. So this is a blow by blow to reestablish, and maintain the Monroe Doctrine, which basically says South America and North America is America's. Get out. And the global war for energy, which is the underpinning of AI and database expansion. It's very interesting, and I'm going to bring you a specific interview on this within the next month. All right, let's talk about the European Union, shall we? The meat of the show, so to speak. The European Union actually began, it had its genesis in 1952. It started with the European Coal and Steel Community, unions, left-wing unions, in fact. And it evolved over the years. It was eventually founded as the European Union by the Maastricht Treaty, November 1, 1993. Gee, almost, X amount of years to the date here in just a few weeks. It's a political and economic union and a military union through its arm, NATO. Between European countries, it sets policies concerning the members. Think about this. Think about the sovereignty that various countries have given up to be a member of this globalist collective. The members' economies, their societies, their laws, and to some extent, their security, and the rampant illegal immigration that's going on, much to the detriment of many countries, Germany, England, France, to name a few. Many people consider the EU as an overblown globalist bureaucracy run by morons. I happen to fall in that camp. Others who are statists, the more power that's federalized and concentrated, the better. Because after all, we are all sheep and we need to be told what to do. That's kind of the two schools of thought. And of course, in the middle, you have the elitists who run the show, who are jealous of their power and whatever skimming, financial skimming they're doing off the top, and I'm sure it's hefty. So a lot of people think that the European Union, its original formation, was perhaps in some ways laudable, worth surrendering some sovereignty to for the economic benefits of no tariffs and free movement between countries for inhabitants and citizens. It's been a gradual process since 1952 for the EU to get to where it is. At the end of World War II, Europe was really two pieces. The communist Soviet bloc piece, the Eastern Baltic states, and the Western quote-unquote democracies. And then, of course, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Eastern Baltic states were suddenly free. And they were poor, they were impoverished, they had no industry. They had been living under communist rule for decades and decades. And of course, they wanted the comfort and they wanted the financial support of the more wealthy Western European countries. So this gave impetus to the European Union. One of the things they were trying to get done, and it's kind of interesting because the original intent of the European Union, amongst other things, coal, steel, iron ore, right, the fulcrums of industry. Some countries had the abilities to process it, and other countries had the abilities to create the raw material. So the European Union kind of bound all these countries together to make extraction and processing and distribution seamless. And it worked for a while. There's a ECSC that originated. And the ECSC was kind of the economic arm of what became the European Union. And the ECSC is what really began to structure the governmental skeleton, which is now the overbearing organization of the EU as it relates to its heavy-handed control over European populations and sovereign European states. Okay, they established the ECSC. It was a supranational That's S-U-P-R-A. In other words, it transcended the abilities of individual countries to think and act for themselves. And the ECSC formed a Council of Ministers, a Common Assembly, a High Authority, a Court of Justice, a legislature of types to resolve disputes and create quote-unquote laws. And the EU would emerge from all those bodies in its current overbloated bureaucratic form. There was a European defense community proposed in the mid-1950s, way back when. And that almost brought down the ECSC, and it almost curtailed the formation of the EU. In fact, that was because France's National Assembly voted it down. France did not want to be beholden to any other country in defense. The ECSC led to two new treaties. They were both called the Treaty of Rome. That established the European Atomic Energy Community, which was to pool knowledge on atomic energy and atomic energy development, which, of course, in the days of the solar and the wind over the last decade, they've dismantled, which is one of the things we're going to talk about next week in terms of their demise. And by 1970, trade within the common market, okay, and this was not all 28 countries that now constitute the EU, it was about half that many, had increased fivefold, which of course made it more attractive for other countries to join. And they established the Common Agricultural Policy about then, the CAP, C-A-P. This was ostensibly to help local farmers and farming and put an end to farming monopolies and distribution monopolies. Well, we've seen where that goes because I've brought you stories over the last 2 years where the elitists, the global warming globalists, have been euthanizing hundreds of thousands of cows and chickens and other livestock and forcing farmers out of business or to turn their land over to the state or for other purposes. In Denmark, in France, in Spain. So the CAP, which was meant to help the farmers, evolved into a much more sinister hammer against farmers, agriculture, and the production of food in the EU, which has created some of the turmoil and some of the risks to European populations that we're going to discuss in the next show. By the way, the CAP was based on subsidies by European countries to farmers back then. Because Europe, as we're going to discuss next week, is really big on subsidies. Because if you take their money, they got you by the hairies, shall we say. All right. It's also caused them to come close to growing broke, although give them a little bit of time, not much, they'll get there. In the 1960s, there was a power struggle amongst the larger countries in what was to become the EU in 1993. And from there arose the concept of unanimous agreement on key issues. So the EU was set up so that one member state could veto the whole 9 yards. Kind of like one veto on the Security Council of the United Nations can thwart the entire will of the General Assembly and the Security Council. On June 23, 2016, the United Kingdom, Britain, who was very reluctant to join the EU, in fact, it did not become a quote-unquote member of the ECSC, the predecessor, until 1973, withdrew from the EU. There's a reserve clause in the EU quote-unquote constitution, whatever that is. And it used it, and that's called Brexit, and you're familiar with it. You've heard about it. Although the elitists in Britain, including the current government, which is at a 13% popularity, 13%. The French government is at 15%. Other countries are between 13 and 18%. Do you get an idea what's happening in Europe? But the United Kingdom voted to leave the EU and became the first state to use that release clause, it's called. But the final Brexit has been stalled by the elitists in England, and the EU is desperately trying to get England to rejoin. We shall see. I don't think so. All right. One of the things that happened during Reagan's term was that the EU feared America was moving away from them. Maybe rightfully so, maybe not. But they used that to bring in more countries to the fold, right? Fear is a very persuasive weapon. Think about back to C-19 and some other events we've had in the recent past. And foreign policy began to evolve as a, should we say, responsibility of the EU rather than member states, with disastrous effect. Just take a look at what's happening in Ukraine, Russia, and Europe right now. And we've talked about that. On February 7th, 1992, when the treaty was signed, effective November 1 of 1993, the Maastricht Treaty, the EEC and the ECSC, the predecessors, became the European Union. And it was based on three pillars at that time: the Constitution of the European Union, if you want to call it that, the Charter, giving more power to the European Parliament, a common security and foreign policy, and, very specifically written out, involvement in the domestic affairs of member nations on justice and home affairs. And here's where the big rub comes in, as we will discuss next week. Be careful what you ask for. One planned side effect, admittedly, by the elites at that time, was closer economic union and the creation of a single market that could compete with Japan at that time and the United States. China was just rising. The EU has gotten more and more involved in the affairs of member states and the European populations. They passed a bill, if you will, called the Human Rights Act, which overrode many member states' local laws. And it produced rules allowing free movement within the EU borders. And it allowed the mass migrations, which are having such a detrimental effect on Europe as a whole and a number of European countries. I mean, even more detrimental than the mess that we've had here in the United States. In 1995, Sweden, Austria, and Finland joined the EU. And in 1999, the Treaty of Amsterdam was signed, which supposedly would bring employment, better working and living conditions, and other social and legal justice issues. Remember social justice? Yes, social justice and legal issues to those countries and the rest of the EU. So the EU, folks, formed a convention. In 2002, they had a convention on the future of Europe to write an EU constitution to replace the original charter. The draft was signed in 2004 to install a permanent EU president, a permanent EU foreign minister, and a charter of rights. Well, charter of rights is not quite like the Bill of Rights that we have in the United States. It's far less stringent and far less enforceable by the population. France and Netherlands failed to ratify it, and it died on the vine at that time, but they're trying to rebirth it now as, shall we say, the member states become more and more antsy, and the populations within the member states become more and more pissed off. This gives you the overview of the EU, how it was formed. Obviously, it has degenerated, as you know, into a create fear by blaming the entire world situation on Russia, and I think wrongfully accusing Putin and Russia of wanting to invade Europe. I don't think it's the last thing they want to do. They have everything going for them right now. They don't need to do anything, right? More importantly, they know, and you and I know, particularly given Russia's history and being invaded by everybody from all angles for the last 1,000 years, the 2,000-mile border they share with, right now, their friend, China, and their 2 million man army as opposed to China's 10 million man army with 200 million men in the reserve, is worrisome. How's that? I'll just leave it at that. They have a lot of resources that China would love to get their hands on, just like the West would love to get their hands on, right? Poor Russia it's the land of resources. It has one of the best economies in the world, despite the misplaced sanctions to our detriment by the Obama and Biden, Obama third term administrations. And all this plays into a whirlpool, which is sucking the EU down the proverbial toilet drain. But we'll talk about that next week. And more importantly, we'll talk about what happens to the United States and to the world and to you, your finances, your property, and your freedoms, if the EU does crumble in any material or significant way. So, this is Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side Radio and the Cowboys Take. Make sure to visit the website, read the articles, see the videos. There's a pile of stuff posted there for you on therightsideradio.com. Please, if you think this is beneficial, pass this link on to others. We're going to get serious about this channel now that we have, through no help of mine, the technology to do it. And the more people we can get it out to, the better. Please hit the like, please hit the subscribe, hit the little bell so you know when these things come out, and that'd be much appreciated. It costs you nothing. And knowledge, folks, is power. The more knowledge you have, the more powerful you will be. Keep the wind at your back. We'll talk to you in a few days.
Please remember, if you've missed any shows, just click on Show Archive and you'll find all of his shows. We look forward to seeing you here again next week for another episode of Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side.